In the vast wilderness of Washington state, something strange has been unfolding for decades, something measured not in sound or sight, but in absence. Hikers vanish without trace, their camps left untouched, compasses drift, maps distort, and low vibrations hum beneath the ground where no machinery exists. Official reports speak of environmental interference, yet the files are incomplete and the numbers never align. From Olympic to Gifford Pinchot, patterns have formed circles of silence, magnetic corridors, and hollow ground that swallows radar. What began as isolated mysteries has grown into a quiet geometry stretching across the state, connecting every disappearance and every unexplainable sound. Rangers hear it, satellites record it, but no one claims to understand it. Beneath the moss, the trees, and the centuries of still rain, something in these forests continues to move slowly, rhythmically marking a pattern that refuses to end. The vanishing trailhead. In the deep greens of Washington state, there are paths that begin clearly and end in silence. Every year, hikers enter these forests, Olympic, Gifford Pinchot, Mount Baker Snoqualmie, following signs carved with arrows and elevation counts. The maps show distance, terrain, and difficulty, but none of them show where the trail stops existing. One of the earliest disappearances recorded in the Olympic National Forest happened in 1958. A 2-year-old man named Harold Fisher parked his grey Studebaker at the Deer Park trailhead and left a note on the dashboard. Back by Thursday. He was never seen again. The search lasted 11 days. The dog units followed his scent up to a moss-covered clearing before it ended. No sign of struggle, no tracks beyond that point. The report, archived in Port Angeles, mentions the final detail simply: trail faded. Through the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, cases like this multiplied quietly. In 1972, 2 college students from Tacoma vanished near Mount Rainier's Carbon River entrance. Their tent was found dry, food untouched, and a notebook containing sketches of trees and coordinates. The Forest Service logs show more anomalies: that decade missing persons, abandoned camps, and strange footprints recorded by rangers near Snoqualmie Pass. By the late 1,980 seconds, the disappearances formed what researchers later described as a linear pattern. A forest analyst named Gerald F. Barnes presented his findings in 1989 at a conservation symposium in Spokane. Using US Geological survey maps, he marked each missing person case with a red dot. The pattern traced what looked like a corridor running north from Mount St. Helens, crossing Gifford Pinchot National Forest and ending near Goat Rocks Wilderness. When asked about its meaning, Barnes reportedly said, "It's as if the land itself selects." Local tribal elders spoke of this long before records were kept. The Quinault and Cowlitz tribes both described zones of silence deep within the woods, places where birds do not sing and compasses spin. Anthropologist Clara Wren wrote in 1924 that the Quinault referred to them as the resting trails, paths that belonged to the old ones before the smoke. In 1996, a series of incidents revived the question. Between May and August, 5 hikers went missing within a 70-mile stretch between Mount Adams and the Columbia River Gorge. Each was last seen walking alone, and all left behind working radios and maps. The official explanation cited disorientation, weather changes, and falls. But local rescuers noted that several of the missing were experienced mountaineers, 2 of them trained in navigation. Their gear was found miles apart, in areas not marked on their original itineraries. Satellite imaging done in 2004 revealed odd clearings deep in Gifford Pinchot, perfect circles of lighter vegetation, each roughly 60 feet across, appeared at equidistant interval. Forestry technician Miguel Santos noted in a memo, "No burn marks, no windfall, no signs of human machinery. Vegetation density resets every few years, as if the ground restarts itself. These circles align almost perfectly with the corridor barns mapped 15 years earlier." In 2011, US Forest Service Ranger Daniel Holt reported an encounter near one of these clearings. His incident log describes hearing rhythmic tapping, like wood on stone, continuing for several minutes after he radioed his location. He later found his compass needle locked east and his Jeep's losing signal. The log ends with the sentence, "Return direction uncertain, marking site for review." The site was reviewed the following spring, but no further notes were added to the record. Locals around Packwood and Randall often mention the hum, a low-frequency vibration heard at night during early spring, lasting anywhere from minutes to hours. Audio recordings captured by amateur researchers in 2018 showed consistent decibel fluctuations matching those recorded near Mount Rainier's geothermal vents. Yet these sounds appeared far from any volcanic zones. Some believe the pattern could relate to subsurface resonance natural frequencies produced by caverns or magma channels. Others, including a small team from the University of Washington in 2019, proposed it may involve magnetic anomalies. Their report concluded localized distortions in magnetic flux density correspond with known disappearance coordinates within a 5% margin. The public version of this study was later removed from the university's archive for data revision. Archival forest maps printed before 1950 show additional trails routes that no longer appear on modern charts. One such path, labelled Old Fireline 7, ran directly through the corridor Barnes once identified. In 2007, a storm exposed fragments of metal posts and a rusted boundary marker reading Fed Survey 1919. These artifacts suggest that older forest divisions may have followed geographic alignments now obscured by regrowth. The absence of sound has become a recurring detail in witness reports. Hunters describe entire stretches of forest where insects stop, birds vanish, and even wind seems absorbed. A 2015 field report by biologist Elaine March noted that decibel levels inside one of these zones dropped to 18 decibels quieter than most recording studios. She wrote, "Auditory flatline sustained for 6 minutes, no wind shift, no visible cause." In the years since, hikers continue to disappear sometimes, only yards from established trails. In 2022, a family camping near Trout Lake found an abandoned backpack containing a camera. The last photograph showed a trail sign half covered in moss pointing toward Boundary Ridge. That trail, according to forest maps, has not existed since 1979. If one were to overlay all known cases from Fisher in 1958 to the Trout Lake discovery, the line runs through mountain valleys, old fire breaks, and decommissioned service roads. It cuts through history, through untouched canopy, ending near an unnamed ridge east of Mount Adams. The forest there is dense and unmarked, where moss buries the wood of forgotten structures. The last satellite pass over this area, captured in March 2023, shows a new clearing circular, silent, perfectly formed. Something moves within Washington's national forests. Not loud, not visible, but measurable through absence of people, of sound, of reason. The line continues north, tracing a geometry that no one claims to understand. And somewhere along that corridor, a trail still begins. It waits beneath the cedar and rain, leading inward, toward a point that remains unmarked on every map. The disappearance index. Between 1,999 and 2021, over 200 individuals were officially recorded as missing within the boundaries of Washington's national forests. Yet when cross-referenced with state and federal records, the total drops to fewer than half that number. The discrepancy is not one of error, it is one of omission. The Washington State Missing Persons Database, maintained by the State Patrol, lists only those cases reported directly to law enforcement. Many forest disappearances begin instead with park rangers, local sheriffs, or volunteer groups. These cases enter field logs and incident reports, but never reach the centralized databases. When journalist Raymond Leclerc filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 2017 seeking all missing person incidents in Gifford Pinchot National Forest between 1960 and 2016, the US Forest Service replied with 14 pages of heavily redacted material. Several dates were missing. The names had been replaced by coded initials. Leclerc compared these with local newspaper archives and found mismatches. Reports from the Chronicle and Centralia described at least 8 disappearances during the same years that did not appear in the FOIA release. His follow-up correspondence with the Forest Service received a brief note. Records beyond current retention schedule may not exist, yet other divisions within the agency confirmed older logs were stored in off-site archives near Portland. No explanation was provided for why they were not included. Among the redacted pages, one entry remained partly readable. It referred to Case 746B, probable cross-boundary incident, filed near the southern edge of Mount Rainier National Park. That same year, 2 hikers from Yakima James Dalton and Peter Fry were declared missing. Their families recall being told the men might have crossed into private timberland, voiding the federal search protocol. No follow-up report was ever issued. The last note in the surviving document reads simply, transfer to regional authority. No such authority was identified. By 2009, digital mapping had allowed volunteers to build their own index. A group known as the Cascadia Recovery Initiative began collating open-source information, obituaries, local news items, ranger notes. They uploaded their findings to a publicly accessible spreadsheet. Within a year, the list contained 312 entries, spanning back to 1,937. The Forest Service contacted the group in 2011, requesting that certain coordinates be removed to preserve public safety. Afterward, the initiative's site quietly shut down. A former search and rescue coordinator named Ellen Graves, who served in Pierce County between 1985 and 2003, later confirmed that specific cases were filed under what she called suppression codes. These were temporary classification numbers meant for internal incidents where environmental sensitivity applied, such as the discovery of ancient remains or protected species habitats. Graves noted that several missing hiker reports shared the same codes. When pressed by Leclerc in a 2020 interview, she said only they didn't want certain places becoming destinations. Old ranger logs reveal further irregularities. In 1975, a field entry at Goat Rocks reads, "Subject located, retrieval pending," yet no retrieval record exists afterward. Another, from 1,983 mentions, camp observed, unclaimed, refer to prior file. The prior file is missing from both paper and digital archives. In 1991, following a flood that damaged storage units in Vancouver, Washington, hundreds of microfilm reels were reportedly lost, but only certain forests records, Olympic, Mount Baker Snoqualmie, and Gifford Pinchot, were affected. Statisticians later tried to reconstruct the numbers using search logs from local sheriff departments. One, compiled by analyst Trevor Hume in 2015, demonstrated a recurring numeric ratio, roughly one disappearance for every 44,000 visitors, far exceeding the national average of 1 per 120,000. When he presented these results to a Department of the Interior Review Board, the data was labelled non-verifiable due to incomplete primary sources. Some within the Forest Service attribute the issue to legacy filing systems. Before the National Incident Management System standardized reports in 2004, each region had its own codes, abbreviations, and filing thresholds. A missing entry could be downgraded to overdue, then closed as resolved no contact, even when no subject was recovered. These subtle reclassifications erased many cases statistically while keeping the paperwork technically complete. In 2018, an independent researcher named Rachel Ng uncovered a collection of scanned typewritten memos from 1,968 to 1,972 labelled Special Observations Anomalous Field Reports. Stored in the National Archives under a miscellaneous Forestry Division code, the files mention topographic interference, instrument drift, and non-standard radiation readings in areas now known to overlap the disappearance corridor. Several refer to index points, a phrase later borrowed by Ng to title her own report, the Disappearance Index, anomalous cases of the Pacific Northwest. Her work drew connections between missing persons data and geological surveys. In one section, she noted that many unrecorded disappearances occurred near areas where underground basalt formations create magnetic distortion. Old mining maps confirm these faults, running diagonally beneath Mount Adams, intersecting the same regions marked decades earlier by Gerald Barnes. One memo dated the 3rd of March 1969 stands out, recommend exclusion of public entry pending subsurface review, noted pattern of absence consistent with index thresholds. The attached survey diagram shows 4 dots in a curved line. In the margin, someone had written, "Suppress for now." Modern Forest Service employees rarely speak about missing data. A communications officer for Region 6, interviewed in 2022, maintained that all viable records are retained in accordance with federal law. Yet when asked about FOIA Case 2-1FS1147, which sought recent disappearances from 2018 onward, the agency responded that no such cases were logged. During the same period, the National Park Service recorded at least 5 incidents less than 10 miles from forest boundaries. Satellite and drone imagery hint at patterns unaccounted for in the official index. Infrared scans from 2020 reveal temperature anomalies along the same coordinates where missing reports cluster. The readings show cold voids areas cooler than the surroundings by several degrees, sometimes circular, sometimes elongated like trenches. These anomalies coincide with the forest's restricted zones, where public access is limited to research personnel. Within online archives, fragments of the Cascadia Recovery Initiative still remain. One spreadsheet cell, partially recovered from cache, contains the entry Holt D 2011 Clearing 22 Compass Drift Logged. Daniel Holt was the ranger who recorded strange tapping sounds that year. The entry number 22 appears to correspond with one of the circular clearings visible in recent satellite images. When Ng presented these overlapping data points at a symposium in 2021, she ended her paper with a short note. The disappearance index is not a count. It is a signal. It rises and falls. It appears where maps lose certainty. Washington's forests hold their own form of arithmetic entries, missing from ledgers, names replaced by codes, coordinates overwritten by weather and growth. The pattern remains steady, invisible to tourists and hikers who see only trees and water. Yet beneath those layers of soil and silence, the numbers continue to rearrange themselves, as if some unseen mechanism inside the land still keeps score. The sound beneath the pines. Sound travels differently in the deep woods of Washington. It moves in ways that seem to bend around trunks, to vanish in pockets of stillness. Over the years, hikers, rangers, and local residents have described a persistent low vibration they simply call the hum. It is not wind or thunder, not the sound of distant logging. It appears in patterns, steady, rhythmic, and often without an obvious source. The earliest mention of the hum comes from a forestry report dated June 1947, filed near the Hamahama River in the Olympic National Forest. A crew clearing deadfall described a pressure tone that caused their tools to rattle on the ground. The note in the log reads, "Audible frequency below perception, felt more than heard." At that time, there were no instruments in the field capable of measuring subsonic waves. The event was left unexplained. By the late 1970 seconds, with advances in portable recording devices, similar phenomena began appearing in civilian accounts. Residents of Forks, Packwood, and Trout Lake described nights when the ground seemed to hum. Car windows trembled softly. Dogs refused to lie down. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer ran a short feature on the 9th of February 1978 under the headline, "Forest Floor Sings at Night." Scientists attributed it to distant industrial noise refracted by temperature layers. Yet the areas where it occurred had no factories, no traffic corridors, and no seismic activity recorded at the time. In 2003, a group of graduate students from the University of Washington's Department of Earth and Space Sciences placed a set of geophones near Goat Rock's wilderness. Their instruments recorded a sustained frequency between 9 and 13 Hz, well below the threshold of human hearing, but strong enough to register as vibration. The pattern repeated every 42 minutes for nearly 5 hours. The students returned the following week and found the signal gone. One of them, Mark Ellis, later recalled, "It was like the ground itself had been breathing." A similar set of readings appeared in 2011 near Mount Adams. The same year, Ranger Daniel Holt filed his report about rhythmic tapping sounds near a clearing. Acoustic analyst Gillian Moore reviewed Holt's audio logs and noted that the tapping contained subharmonic intervals identical to those captured by Ellis 8 years earlier. She described them as mechanical rhythms produced by no known machinery. Local folklore sometimes connects the hum to the resting trails mentioned by the Quinault people. Anthropologist notes from the early 20th century describe forest zones where even birds grew silent. These were said to be the pathways of the old spirits of the ground, though the phrase loses precision in translation. Elders spoke of places where the world underneath still turns. In modern field tests, researchers began to detect magnetic fluctuations accompanying the sound. On the 4th of May 2018, a volunteer monitoring station at Windy Ridge recorded a gradual deviation of 2.7 microteslas, the needle oscillating in sync with the hum. The same pattern appeared 60 miles north near Snoqualmie Pass 3 weeks later. Two separate instruments, identical waveform. Sound engineers studying infrasound phenomena suggested a natural cause, perhaps the resonance of air through ancient lava tubes or pressure shifts across subterranean caverns. A 2019 paper by Dr. Malcolm Troy proposed that Washington's Cascade Range acted like a giant organ, its basalt layers amplifying wind through unseen hollows. But the problem with that theory was repetition. The hum did not depend on weather. It recurred at intervals, almost as if scheduled. Old residents began to keep their own records. A retired park warden in Randall, known locally as Doc, charted each occurrence between 1,990 and 2,020 inches, a spiral notebook. He logged 183 nights of audible vibration, each lasting between 30 and 90 minutes. In the margin of one entry from April 2007, he wrote, "Coincides with missing hiker search, Cougar Creek area." The correlation would later be confirmed. One of the disappearances that year occurred within hours of his note. In 2020, an independent researcher named Rachel Ng, the same one who compiled the Disappearance Index, partnered with acoustic physicist Robert Lund to map the hum's spread. They used low-frequency recorders positioned in a grid across 50 miles of forest. Over a 3-month period, 36 of those stations detected synchronized pulses traveling north to south at a speed too slow to be seismic, but too coordinated to be random. Lund described them as acoustic shadows moving under the surface. At the same time, anomalies began appearing on thermal scans. Satellite imaging in the infrared band showed zones that cooled during the hum's presence, reversing the usual heat pattern. The air above these areas dropped by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. Meteorologists could not explain the phenomenon. No weather fronts matched the timing. The hum seems indifferent to human presence. Campers have recorded it while fires still burned beside them, their smoke undisturbed. The tone passes through wood, stone, and skin alike, more felt than heard. Some witnesses describe nausea, others mild vertigo. One forestry intern noted that his wristwatch lost 2 minutes during a 40-minute episode. His supervisor's digital watch remained unchanged. In June 2021, the US Geological Survey conducted a quiet field test near Mount Adams, placing ground sensors and magnetometers across 3 valleys. Though the results were never publicly released, an internal summary later surfaced in an academic forum. It described persistent infrasound activity of undetermined origin, accompanied by transient magnetic phase shifts. The last line read, "Phenomenon may extend beneath mapped strata." The idea of something beneath the forest, something that produces both vibration and silence, has been circulating since the earliest ranger diaries. Holt's successor, Ranger Emily Vance, once described walking through an area where the hum ceased mid-stride. She felt the sudden absence like air pressure changing. Her report ends with, "Immediate stillness. Ears rang afterward. Returned same path, sound resumed." Today, the hum remains one of the most measurable, yet unexplained aspects of Washington's forests. It appears in data logs, in witness accounts, in frequencies recorded by machines that cannot lie. Yet its pattern aligns too closely with the vanished trails, the clearings, and the missing. It follows a path underground, beneath pines that have grown over old foundations, through stone chambers the maps no longer mark. The sound does not call attention to itself. It continues without pause, like breath below the surface, waiting for someone to listen long enough to hear its shape. The magnetic corridor. In the forests of Washington, compasses do not always agree. Travelers report sudden shifts, needles turning east, spinning in circles, or locking at strange angles far from true north. Hikers call it the pull. Rangers call it deviation. Geologists prefer the term localized flux disturbance. No matter the name, it traces a quiet line through the wilderness, a corridor invisible to the eye, yet marked by magnetism itself. The first government record of this anomaly appears in a 1954 geological survey conducted by the US Coast and Geodetic Survey. In Section 12 of the report, under Instrument Drift, inspectors noted erratic compass readings near Goat Rocks, a region that would later fall precisely within the disappearance corridor. The notation, brief and unelaborated, reads, "Field compass deviation recorded at 14 degrees east. No iron deposits detected." At the time, magnetometer technology was still limited, and the anomaly was dismissed as an error of calibration. Through the decades, similar disturbances appeared again and again. In 1966, a Forest Service team mapping reforestation zones around Mount Adams reported that their navigation tools repeatedly failed along a narrow east-west strip of terrain. When rechecked, the same line produced distortions on a theodolite compass, even with replacement parts. One surveyor, identified only as M. Haskins, wrote in the field log, "We walked 20 yards and the map changed." By the late 1970 seconds, geological mapping had become more precise. Portable magnetometers allowed detailed measurements of flux density, and it became clear that certain forest regions exhibited values far higher than expected. A 1,979 internal memorandum from the Department of Natural Resources documented flux readings of over 67,000 nanoteslas, nearly double the baseline for the surrounding area. Curiously, the Anomalies axis ran in a straight north-south orientation from Mount St. Helens towards Snoqualmie Pass, mirroring the same path later identified in the Disappearance Index. In 1983, Dr. Henry Collier of the Pacific Northwest Geophysical Institute conducted a 3-week expedition to measure subterranean conductivity. Using resistivity profiling, his team discovered a continuous band of low-resistance rock beneath the forests, suggesting a vast corridor of magnetic minerals or metallic ore stretching for almost 100 miles. Yet drilling samples later revealed no such deposits. Collier's final report concluded the formation conducts magnetism but contains no apparent ferromagnetic material. The finding contradicted known physics and was quietly archived. Field anomalies persisted. In 1992, search and rescue units near Mount Rainier reported compass errors during an operation for 2 missing climbers. A helicopter's navigation instruments malfunctioned over the same area, forcing a manual return guided by visual landmarks. The incident file, stored in Pierce County archives, includes the line, "Magnetic interference likely environmental. Recommend avoidance of sector." When Rachel Ng examined these records decades later, she noticed that every known instance of large-scale flux deviation occurred directly beneath previously reported hum zones. The data aligned with the circular clearings, first captured in 2004 satellite images, each a precise node along what she called the magnetic corridor. One of the more striking modern cases occurred in 2015, when a group of hikers in Gifford Pinchot National Forest recorded their G-paths diverging by nearly 0.3 miles while standing side by side. They uploaded the data to a hiking forum, believing it to be a software error. The forum moderator, an amateur geophysicist, recognized the coordinates as matching a restricted survey area, once labeled subsection 22. No official explanation was ever given for the restriction. Magnetic surveys conducted by the University of Oregon in 2017 produced high-resolution maps of the Cascade Range. These showed an elongated region of magnetic distortion shaped like a ribbon, widening and narrowing in rhythmic intervals, almost as though responding to an unseen pulse beneath the Earth. When modeled in 3D software, the distortion mirrored the curvature of a buried channel, an ancient lava conduit sealed long ago. The researchers proposed that slow, shifting currents of magnetite-rich fluid might remain trapped below. Yet this theory failed to explain the corridor's mobility. Satellite data indicated that the distortion moved slightly north each year, advancing about 0.8 miles annually. Old Ranger anecdotes describe smaller effects on the surface. Radios lose signal. Cameras record static interference. In one case from 2008, a hiker's digital compass displayed negative numbers before freezing entirely. When the data card was reviewed, the timestamp showed a gap of 7 minutes, with no recorded movement, just blank telemetry, as if the device had ceased to exist for that interval. A 2020 paper by physicist Eric Holm, titled Geomagnetic Drift Along the Cascadia Axis, offered one of the few public discussions of the phenomenon. Holm suggested that an unknown variable within the crust was altering magnetic declination faster than models predicted. He stopped short of speculation, but included a footnote that drew attention. Certain regions exhibit coherence between magnetic drift and seismic silence. In other words, where the magnetism intensified, earthquakes ceased. This pattern caught the attention of the US Geological Survey in 2021. Teams placed magnetometers along a 70-mile transect from Mount St. Helens to the Columbia River Gorge. Over 4 months, they recorded continuous microfluctuations occurring at precisely 27-hour intervals. These waves of magnetic pressure traveled northward like a heartbeat under stone. Unconfirmed field notes from the study mention an acoustic resonance accompanying the flux changes, possibly tied to the infrasound hum previously documented. If accurate, it suggests that the magnetic corridor and the subterranean vibration may be part of the same mechanism, one electrical, one acoustic. When superimposed over missing person coordinates, the alignment is exact. Every major disappearance cluster, from 1,958 onward lies within a 1-mile band of the corridor's centerline. Even older cases, drawn from fragmented ranger logs of the 1,930 seconds, fall into place when the map is extended south toward Oregon. The forest's pattern of absence appears to trace a natural compass line that resists all human measurement. Some field technicians began marking trees with chalk arrows to note compass deviations, but within weeks the marks faded, washed away by weather or overgrown by moss. The forest seems to erase attempts at permanence. Instruments fail, batteries drain faster, and metallic tools lose magnetization. One researcher, holding a compass near a clearing, wrote in her notebook, "North pulled down." In later years, the magnetic corridor became less a map feature and more a phrase whispered among those who work in the field. It is spoken with calm familiarity, like a road no one drives anymore, but still appears faintly on old charts. The corridor's position continues to shift each season, unmeasured yet constant, as though following an unseen command buried deep beneath the pines. The missing hours. In Washington's forests, time does not always move in a straight line. There are accounts quietly written into ranger reports and handwritten journals of watches halting, radios falling out of sync, and travelers returning hours late without realizing it. They remember their path clearly, yet the daylight when they emerge does not match what they recall entering under. The first known mention of this came from a 1,962 incident report filed in the Mount Baker, Snoqualmie National Forest. A maintenance worker named Thomas Hill was part of a 3-man trail crew clearing brush near Glacier Creek. According to his partners, Hill stepped away to relieve himself and was gone for roughly 5 minutes. When he returned, the other men claimed he had been missing for over 2 hours. The crew's wristwatches and log entries confirmed the gap. Hill, confused and calm, insisted he had walked no more than a few yards from the site. The report's closing line reads, "Subject in sound condition, discrepancy unresolved." More of these time losses appear in fragments over the next decades. In 1979, a climber descending from Goat Rocks recorded in his field diary that his altimeter and watch both froze for precisely 17 minutes while he rested beside a stream. When the instruments resumed, his analog clock jumped forward an hour, though its mechanism showed no signs of damage. He noted that the forest around him seemed unnaturally still, as if something had stopped breathing. In the 1,980 seconds, a string of similar cases led to internal memos within the US Forest Service referring to temporal anomalies, a term that was later redacted in declassified releases. One report from 1,987 mentioned a ranger named Julia Fraser, who lost track of an entire afternoon while performing a solo survey along the Lewis River. Her field recorder, set to run continuously, captured only white noise between 13:10 and 16:45. When technicians analysed the tape, they found it was not blank. It contained electromagnetic interference consistent with proximity to a magnetic storm, though none had been recorded in the region that day. By 1994, several disappearances were associated with missing time accounts. A volunteer rescue worker from Cowlitz County, interviewed years later, recalled searching near the Muddy Fork Trail during a multi-day operation. "Our watches wouldn't agree," he said. "Mine was 15 minutes ahead of the Jeep. Others were behind. It was like time bent around the place." Their radio logs show intervals of silence between transmissions, though the devices were never switched off. A digital era brought better instruments and deeper confusion. In 2006, an engineer hiking near the Columbia River Gorge set his camera to record a time-lapse of the forest canopy for 6 hours. When he reviewed the footage, he found 3 missing segments, totaling 21 minutes of blank frames. The surrounding timestamps flowed normally, as if the world had briefly ceased to register light. Researchers from the University of Washington's physics department conducted controlled experiments in 2012, placing synchronized atomic watches at 5 points along what was by then being called the magnetic corridor. 4 watches remained stable. The 5th, placed near an unmarked clearing northwest of Trout Lake, drifted ahead by 2.7 seconds after only 48 hours. Though the result was within technical error limits, the team repeated the test in 2015 and 2019. Each time, the same device advanced faster than the rest, despite being recalibrated and replaced with new hardware. Rachel Ng, who had studied the disappearance index, examined these anomalies in her later report Chronometry in Closed Systems, Field Deviations Across Washington's Forest Corridor. She argued that small, localized gravitational shifts might explain the differences. perhaps caused by density variations underground. Yet she noted that the direction of time's distortion, always forward, suggested a uniform acceleration rather than random fluctuation. Not all accounts are scientific. Some are personal, written in notebooks found in abandoned camps or retrieved from recovered hikers. One entry, dated the 17th of August 2018, reads, "Woke up at 3:40 a.m. Checked phone battery at 82%. Next thing I know, the sun's gone. Phone says 9:14 p.m. No memory between." The writer, a woman named Karen Soto, was later located safe near Packwood, but had no recollection of the missing hours. She described her surroundings as bright and grey at the same time, like fog but solid. In 2020, Forest Ranger Emily Vance, who had previously documented the sudden silence associated with the hum, reported her own incident. While walking a monitoring trail north of Mount Adams, she noticed her Jeep showing a straight line of movement despite standing still. She checked her watch, 11:23 a.m. The next entry in her field log, written in her handwriting, is timestamped 14:19. The intervening pages are blank. Her final note reads, "Time discrepancy confirmed, no fatigue, no lapse of awareness." The US Geological Survey has quietly acknowledged that Washington's forest corridor lies above a zone of unusual subsurface conductivity. Studies from 2022 suggest that geomagnetic pulses there could affect low-frequency electronic oscillators, the same components used in watches and navigation devices. But even this fails to account for synchronized human perception gaps, where multiple witnesses lose hours simultaneously without environmental disruption. Audio data from the corridor reveals a curious detail. During periods corresponding to lost time, infrasound sensors register near total silence. No hum, no natural vibration. It is as if the Earth's usual background noise, its steady tremor of life, simply stops. This phenomenon remains unclassified. Officials refer to them as interval lapses. For those who have experienced it, the moments are not frightening, but strangely calm. They describe it as standing between seconds, where the forest holds its breath. When the air moves again and sound returns, so does the clock. To walk into these woods is to enter a place where time itself becomes porous. Minutes do not always equal minutes. The light changes too fast. The watch face advances while thought remains still. Somewhere between the hum and the magnetic drift, Washington's forests create their own measure of duration, a rhythm only the land seems to understand. The silent camps. The deeper you go into Washington's forests, the more the trees begin to resemble walls. Past a certain elevation, even sunlight loses its shape, filtering through in long, still columns. It is here, along the edges of forgotten trails and washed-out ridges, that search teams have found what they now refer to as the silent camps. The first documented discovery occurred on the 2nd of August 1974 in the Olympic National Forest. A ranger patrol investigating reports of smoke found a campsite arranged with near-perfect symmetry. The tent stood intact, the zipper closed, and a small kettle sat beside a cold fire pit. Inside were a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a pair of boots neatly placed side by side. The hiker, whose name was recorded as John Kay, was never found. His wallet, half full of cash, was on the ground beside the mat. The log entry that evening read, "No disturbance, no signs of flight." Throughout the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, similar discoveries multiplied. Campsites found deep within the national forests, Mount Baker Snoqualmie, Gifford Pinchot, Mount Adams showed the same eerie order. Tools laid out as if awaiting inspection. Food containers unopened. Firewood stacked in deliberate shapes. The phenomenon became so routine among rescue units that unofficial codes were developed. SC1 for a single tent site, SC2 for multiple tents. In 1991, the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Department photographed one such location near the Muddy Fork Trail. The tent, faded orange, was pitched perfectly within a clearing. A rope line hung between two trees, holding a towel that had dried stiff in the air. The report noted that the grass inside the clearing was pressed flat in a circular pattern. When the film negatives were examined later, technicians found a faint distortion in the lower left corner of every frame, a blurred section, as if the image itself had been stretched. Ranger Emily Vance, reviewing archival photographs decades later, described them as camps arranged like waiting rooms. She observed that utensils, lanterns, and journals were almost always found aligned toward the north, sometimes directly matching compass drift recorded in the same area. Her field notes include a single line beneath one image, objects facing something that isn't there. One of the best preserved sites was discovered in 2003 near Goat Rocks. A team searching for a missing father and son located their camp after 12 days of grid search. Both tents were undamaged. Inside the first were sleeping bags turned down, books half open, and a wristwatch stopped at 2:46. The second tent contained only clothing, arranged in piles by size. Neither man was recovered, though both their vehicles remained parked at the nearest trailhead. A local journalist who visited the scene described it in his article. Everything spoke of interruption, not panic. Forensic analysis of soil samples from multiple sites revealed few footprints beyond the immediate area and no drag marks leading away. Even in cases discovered within days of reported disappearances, the sites showed no signs of animal activity. Investigators began to refer to them as preserved by absence. A later study by the Washington State Search and Rescue Coordination Office catalogued 67 confirmed silent camps between 1974 and 2021. Of these, 49 lay within 1 mile of the magnetic corridor mapped in earlier geological surveys. 10 sat directly over known infrasound zones, where the forest hum had been measured. None appeared near roads or waterways. In 2010, a forestry technician named Daniel Holt, the same ranger who once reported rhythmic tapping, documented a silent camp in the Adams Wilderness. His photographs, now sealed in regional archives, show a single tent with its entrance open. The fabric moved slightly in the wind, though the interior remained undisturbed. Holt's report ends abruptly with the words, "Auditory fade. Will return with team." No follow-up record exists. The strange arrangement of items at these sites has drawn speculation from psychologists and anthropologists alike. Some suggest that the pattern reflects a state of confusion, individuals overwhelmed, reverting to ritual order before wandering away. Others argue it represents something else, the absence of human error. Nothing at these camps is overturned or broken. There are no signs of struggle, no marks of haste. In one, a dinner plate still held the remains of an uneaten meal. Rachel Ng examined cross-references between the disappearance index and the silent camps report. Her analysis revealed that many of the victims associated with these sites had last been in radio contact near known flux deviation. The arrangement, she wrote, may not be the act of the missing, it may be the condition in which time left them. In 2017, thermal imaging from drones flying above Gifford Pinchot National Forest revealed unusual cold rings around several silent camps precisely circular, with a drop in temperature of 3 degrees Celsius from the surrounding air. The readings persisted even hours after sunset, when differential cooling should have equalized. One drone's navigation system malfunctioned while hovering above the largest ring, forcing an emergency retrieval. A year later, during a separate expedition, a pair of graduate researchers left a test camp overnight to measure ambient temperature changes. When they returned at dawn, their equipment remained, but their tent had rotated slightly clockwise, dragging faint grooves in the soil. No animals or human footprints were visible. The wind that night had been still. Today, search teams treat the discovery of an intact, abandoned camp with quiet procedure. The standard response is to photograph from a distance, mark coordinates, and withdraw. Items are no longer collected unless contamination is evident. The unspoken rule among field officers is simple: do not linger. Each year, the number of silent camps grows, sometimes discovered by accident, sometimes logged only through aerial survey. Many have become overgrown, swallowed by moss, preserved by moisture and distance. In some, the objects remain untouched decades later, sealed beneath fallen needles and lichen. The forest holds them with the same calm precision. It shows everything else, unmoved, unbothered, quietly retaining order long after memory has faded. And in the soft light filtering through the cedar, the tents still stand, silent and waiting, pointing toward a horizon that no longer aligns with north. The eyes in the canopy. Motion sensors were meant to simplify search work. They were quiet tools, infrared beams, trip lines, night vision lenses, all built to record the movements of wildlife and lost hikers in the dense and shifting light of Washington's forests. But the data they began to return was different. The cameras were triggered when nothing visible moved. Batteries drained faster. In some frames, shapes appeared only in half-second exposures, vague, hanging forms between branches that never matched the height of any known animal. The first record of this came from 1998, when park biologist Gerald Horne placed a set of trail cameras across Goat Rock's wilderness. His goal was to monitor elk migration. When he retrieved the film rolls weeks later, 14 of the 24 cameras had malfunctioned. The remaining ones showed odd exposures, faint streaks of light descending vertically through the frame. At first, he blamed moisture and long shutter delay, but in one photograph, a set of circular reflections appeared 2 pale orbs set high among the trees, perfectly aligned, hovering more than 20 feet above the ground. By 2006, digital equipment had replaced film, and the anomalies only multiplied. Cameras deployed near the magnetic corridor produced blurred streaks at the exact same hour across multiple nights, usually between 2 and 3 a.m. In 2009, a University of Washington wildlife team studying owl populations documented unexplained motion detections occurring in the absence of any heat signatures. The devices captured dozens of false triggers without corresponding visual data, as if something cold and moving had passed through their field of view. Ranger reports began to reference the phenomenon indirectly. One 2011 entry by Daniel Holt notes, motion sensors activated no fauna recorded visual anomaly upper canopy. The following spring, his replacement Emily Vance filed a similar note near Mount Adams. Camera triggered 12 times in 30 minutes. Wind calm audio sensor recorded metallic resonance. The archived waveform from that night shows a brief increase in amplitude between 2.5 and 3 Hz, the same range as the infrasound hum. Infrared footage retrieved in 2015 revealed what technicians described as rolling shadows, shapes that drifted laterally through the canopy, altering the light balance without registering as mass. When analyzed frame by frame, the movement matched no known animal gait. A federal wildlife investigator reviewing the footage described it as heat displacement resembling a human outline, vertical, unsupported. The file was marked unverified and stored with the notation environmental anomaly. Several local volunteer search groups, unofficial and unsanctioned, have since tried to replicate these recordings. One team, near the Cispus River Valley, set 12 motion-activated cameras along a 3-mile trail segment. Within 2 nights, all 12 triggered simultaneously, though weather records show no wind or precipitation. Reviewing the memory cards later, the group found every device frozen on a single black frame, with timestamps exactly 5 seconds apart. The data resumed hours later, as if nothing had happened. In 2018, forestry technician Miguel Santos noted a strange coincidence while reviewing satellite imaging for vegetation health. Over a 50-mile section of the Cascade forests, faint vertical distortions appeared in the multispectral imagery, slender shadows that extended above the tree line but cast no measurable shade on the ground. The distortions were spaced evenly, roughly 1 kilometer apart, following the north-south orientation of the magnetic corridor. When the images were taken again 3 months later, the shadows had shifted west by several hundred meters. Researchers analyzing this data encountered a recurring pattern. Wherever motion sensors failed, magnetic interference increased. Compasses nearby displayed drift. Radios cut out. In 2 cases, drone cameras lost stabilization when passing over the coordinates of known silent camps. The footage shows a brief downward tilt, as if the aircraft sensors had momentarily registered something above them. A lesser-known series of events occurred in 2020, when the Washington Department of Natural Resources installed night cameras near a restricted fire zone east of Mount St. Helens. The devices were designed to monitor for illegal camping. Over several weeks, multiple units captured identical sequences, tree branches bending slightly under invisible weight, followed by a flicker of reflected light. The intervals were precise, 47 minutes apart across 3 nights. After the 3rd recording, one camera vanished entirely. Only its metal mounting bracket remained, twisted as though pulled straight upward. Locals who live near the forest edge speak of the watchers. It is an old term, traced back to logging diaries from the 1,910 seconds, when workers in the Cascades described lights among the trees that followed their camps. One log entry from 1,913, preserved at the Lewis County Historical Society, notes, "Something in the timber, higher than birds, turning slow like lanterns." No sightings were ever explained. In 2021, independent researcher Rachel Ng and sound engineer Robert Lund returned to the region to test an idea that the infrasound hum might have an echo above the canopy. They suspended directional microphones from weather balloons to record high-altitude frequencies. On 3 occasions, they captured bursts of electromagnetic noise synchronized with the hum below. The signals came not from the ground, but from the air above it, 40 meters over the tree line. Lund described it as a call and its reflection, like the forest listening back. A follow-up experiment using Lidar scanning in 2022 showed momentary interruptions, thin columns, where the laser failed to return a signal as though absorbed mid-air. These columns appeared over areas already linked to compass deviation. Their coordinates, when plotted, marked a grid stretching north through the forest, faint but consistent, running parallel to the line of disappearances. None of the findings prove intelligence, yet none dismiss it either. The forest offers no overt sign of life beyond the ordinary. But something in the air above those trees reacts to sound, magnetism, and movement. It watches through interference, appearing only in the instruments built to study it. Today, most ranger stations keep silent about camera malfunctions. Reports are marked as technical errors, sensors replaced without comment. Yet, the footage continues to arrive frames that register presence without form, light without heat, eyes that reflect but do not blink. Somewhere between the branches, above the moss and fog, something records us back. The canopy shifts, the sensors hum quietly, and then the screen turns black for a moment too long. The lost signals. For those who work in Washington's forests, communication is more than convenience, it is survival. Radios, repeaters, and satellite messengers form a fragile web that connects remote crews across vast, silent terrain. Yet along certain corridors, this web collapses without warning. Voices dissolve mid-sentence, Jeep's coordinates vanish. Devices reset as though freshly powered on, and in some cases, transmissions continue after the operators have gone missing. The first recorded incident dates to 1964, when a civil defense survey team in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest reported total radio blackout lasting 17 minutes. Their log states that all channels filled with steady static, described as a low mechanical hum layered under higher clicks. When the signal returned, the team's watches showed a 5-minute discrepancy. No atmospheric interference or solar flare was recorded that day. By 1981, search and rescue operations had grown reliant on VHF radios. That summer, a group searching for a missing climber near Goat Rocks reported a series of phantom transmissions voices repeating the call sign of the lead ranger long after he had signed off. The frequency logs recovered later from dispatch showed each transmission precisely 40 seconds apart, beginning the moment the ranger's microphone went silent. Technicians attributed it to signal bounce, but the distance and timing contradicted the explanation. In 1997, the Washington Emergency Management Division installed new repeater towers across the Cascade Range to strengthen coverage. Within months, engineers began to notice unusual frequency drift affecting units stationed between Mount Street Helens and the Columbia River Gorge. Audio tests captured tones oscillating between 18 and 20 Hz, below human hearing, overlaying standard voice frequencies. A memo circulated internally under the title Low Band Interference, Adam Sector, advised operators to minimize transmission duration in affected zones. The interference grew worse in the early 2000s. Firefighters combating the 2003 Dry Creek blaze near Gifford Pinchot reported their radios failing simultaneously for 11 minutes, despite clear skies and unobstructed line of sight. One crew member, later interviewed for a training video, recalled, "The static wasn't normal, it was rhythmic. It sounded like breathing through metal." Independent researcher Rachel Ng revisited archived dispatch audio from these incidents. Using spectrographic analysis, she discovered faint harmonics within the noise, repeating at intervals that matched the magnetic fluctuations of the corridor recorded decades earlier. Her notes described the sound pattern as organized distortion. In 2010, a maintenance technician repairing a repeater near Trout Lake noticed his headset picking up faint speech. The words were indistinct, filtered by static, but when he reviewed the recording later, the timestamp placed the transmission at 3:12 a.m. an hour, when all field stations were confirmed offline. The nearest ranger patrol was 12 miles away. The technician's report was filed, but never published. 3 years later, a group of ham radio operators from Portland recorded a similar anomaly. While testing long-distance communication, they intercepted bursts of analog tone near 462 MHz, a frequency not in use by local agencies. The signals repeated sequences of numbers 11, 19, 23, 11, 1923. The pattern continued for 6 minutes before fading. When the coordinates of the strongest reception were triangulated, they fell directly within the region known for the silent camps. Drone surveillance deployed in 2017 added another layer. Operators noticed that telemetry links failed most often when flying above clearings aligned with the magnetic corridor. The data loss occurred abruptly and returned just as quickly, leaving blank gaps in navigation logs. No hardware faults were found. The phenomenon became known informally among drone technicians as the wash, referring to the sensation of a signal being rinsed clean. In 2019, during a joint operation between the US Forest Service and local volunteers, a radio exchange between two teams suddenly duplicated. Dispatch received the same conversation, twice one live, the other delayed by nearly 4 minutes. The duplicate transmission matched every inflection, pause, and word, yet it played after the original communication had ended. When investigators traced the logs, both recordings originated from the same channel and same transmitter ID. Some believe these echoes may be a form of atmospheric ducting, where layers of air bend radio waves over long distances. But ducting cannot replicate speech delay or consistent pulse intervals. Others think the corridor's magnetic flux may induce signal reflection within the Earth itself, effectively storing transmissions and releasing them seconds or minutes later, an idea explored in a 2021 paper titled Subsurface Echo Phenomena in High-Flux Terrains by physicist Eric Holm. In several ranger stations, dispatchers have quietly compiled lists of what they call lost calls. These are transmissions received without origin, bearing valid call signs of officers no longer active or deceased. One recording from 2015 captures a clear voice saying, "Station 3 moving north," a phrase identical to a 1994 log entry from a ranger who vanished on patrol in the same region. Audio forensics found no evidence of tampering. The transmission's carrier frequency contained the same subharmonic resonance measured during magnetic events. Satellite communications offer little improvement. Between 2020 and 2023, hikers equipped with emergency beacons triggered SOS signals within the corridor that appeared on rescue monitors hundreds of miles away, as if rerouted through a displaced coordinate grid. When teams reached the original GPS points, the distress signals continued to broadcast from above the tree canopy, suspended at elevations inconsistent with ground location. By now, forest personnel accept these failures as routine. Standard procedure dictates that teams working near the corridor maintain line-of-sight contact rather than rely on radios. The recommendation, printed in a 2022 update to the Washington Field Safety Manual, reads, "If transmission ceases, remain stationary. Signal loss may not correspond to distance." The forest's silence is not empty. It is layered with echoes, static, and faint repetitions that linger longer than they should. To call out across these woods is to invite a delayed answer, one that may return after the speaker has already walked away. Somewhere within the interference, voices drift half memory, half reflection, caught between frequencies that never fully fade. The Forbidden Map. In the archives of the Washington Department of Natural Resources lies a drawer labeled Survey Retired. Inside are maps too fragile to handle without gloves hand, inked on linen, faded at the edges, and marked with coordinates that no longer exist on official charts. They show a version of the state that feels slightly out of alignment, where ridges sit a mile north of where they should, rivers bend in ways they do not now bend, and the forests are threaded by roads and boundaries that have long since been erased. These are the Forbidden Maps. The first of them dates to 1899, created by a surveyor named E.J. Halverson. His signature still curls in the corner, beside a symbol that does not appear in any standard legend, a black spiral drawn over what is now the southern edge of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. The spiral encloses a small note in cursive script, "Zone of unstable reading." Later, in 1907, a follow-up survey by the US Geological Service redrew the area as restricted entry timber boundary, omitting the spiral entirely. By 1932, several private logging companies had produced their own internal charts of the same region. One, labelled Adams Ridge Holdings, included faint pencil lines running diagonally from Mount Adams toward the Columbia River. Along these lines appear circles spaced at regular intervals, each marked with 2 letters, X. No explanation is given. In 1954, when the map was copied for corporate transfer, all EX markings were gone, replaced by ordinary contour lines. Cartographer and historian Daniel Rees discovered the originals in 1978 while researching timber ownership disputes. He noticed that the erased markings corresponded with the same coordinates later associated with compass deviation and magnetic flux. His notes mention an alternate grid overlaid beneath Washington's official coordinate system, a geometric alignment invisible to modern mapping. Rees called it the Old Lattice. In 1985, a set of aerial photographs taken by the US Forest Service during a wildfire assessment revealed faint, linear clearings cutting across miles of dense canopy. When plotted over the old maps, the lines matched the missing EX coordinates almost exactly. The clearings were too straight to be natural and too narrow to be modern logging roads. When pilots attempted to photograph them again the following summer, the lines were gone. A declassified memo from 1961, obtained through a later Freedom of Information request, references Legacy Survey's pre-standard projection. It warns field officers that certain pre-grid documents may reference obsolete coordinate anchors incompatible with magnetic north realignment. The memo orders destruction of all unconverted charts, yet scattered copies survived in private collections, often mislabeled or half-burned. Rachel Ng, tracing these fragments in 2019, assembled a composite using digital overlays. Her reconstruction revealed a hexagonal pattern stretching from Mount Street, Helens to Snoqualmie Pass, intersecting with almost every known disappearance site. She noted that the geometry predates the US Public Land Survey system adopted in the 19th century. The precision, she wrote, implies measurement by instruments we no longer possess or knowledge we no longer admit existed. Among the most curious maps is one drawn in 1919 by a government contractor named Isaac Fornell. In addition to standard elevation marks, it features small triangles labelled EL scattered across the terrain. Handwritten notes at the bottom margin read, Elevation Lights Intermittent Observation Nights of June 4, 7, 9. Contemporary reports from that month mention no lightning storms or fires. Modern analysts who re-examined the map found that the triangles align with present-day locations of the circular clearings identified in satellite images nearly a century later. In 1948, the Office of Strategic Mapping briefly catalogued a series of restricted areas known internally as legacy grids. A short surviving abstract lists Washington as one of 4 states containing these grids, each described as zones of geomagnetic irregularity, cause undetermined. All associated field notebooks were destroyed under a retention order in 1956. Yet every few years, pieces of the old maps resurface. In 2008, a storm unearthed a metal survey marker on a ridge above Trout Lake. It bore the inscription Fed Survey 1919, identical to those once noted in archival reports. When geologists plotted its coordinates, it fell precisely on the line connecting the hum zones, silent camps, and magnetic corridor. The marker was removed for analysis, but never displayed. Modern mapping satellites occasionally record brief misalignments when passing over this corridor, digital pixels offset by several meters, as if the topography beneath was shifting against its own coordinates. The imagery corrects itself within seconds, but the raw telemetry shows that for a fraction of a moment, the forest appears duplicated, one layer real, one ghosted, sliding slightly northwest before merging again. Cartographers who have handled the original documents describe a peculiar consistency. Regardless of decade or drafting style, the old maps all share one subtle feature, an empty space near their center where no roads, rivers, or names appear. It is a void in ink, a deliberate omission. On the 1,899 sheet, this blank space is labeled only with a single word, written in faded graphite, center. The forbidden maps are no longer displayed, but archivists keep them stored under controlled light and temperature, each labeled as unstable projection material. When unrolled for study, the paper smells faintly of ozone. The ink shimmers under certain wavelengths, as if reacting to magnetism that has not yet faded. Those who have compared them to modern charts say the old geometry still fits just beneath the surface, as if the forest had been mapped twice, once for the land we see and once for the one that listens beneath it. The Hollow Survey. When the United States Geological Survey began deploying ground-penetrating radar across Washington's Cascade forests in the late 1990 seconds, the goal was simple: chart the subsurface for landslide risk and volcanic fault lines. What they found beneath the magnetic corridor, however, resisted every instrument. Signals sent into the ground did not return. Entire strata absorbed radar pulses as if the rock itself were hollow. The first anomalies appeared in 1998 during a survey east of Mount Adams. Technicians expected dense basalt lava flows solidified millions of years ago. Instead, radar pulses vanished at shallow depths, swallowed in silence. The report filed that August lists the readings as non-reflective zones, extending several hundred meters below the forest floor. At the time, analysts suspected a hardware malfunction, but when replacement units were brought in weeks later, the same result occurred. The data vanished into blank space. Over the next decade, teams from various agencies attempted deeper scans. Magnetotelluric instruments, which measure conductivity through electromagnetic waves, returned irregular results readings, suggesting layers of high conductivity alternating with regions of none at all. In geological terms, this should have been impossible. Soil and stone conduct consistently, even when fractured. Here, the measurements dropped to zero, as though the sensors had reached an internal boundary. In 2005, a small team from Oregon State University, led by geophysicist Dr. Robert Leland, drilled test cores in an area northwest of Trout Lake. At 214 meters, the drill bit met resistance. Then, a sudden drop. The torque sensor registered a void. When the core sample was retrieved, it showed a fine grey powder, unlike any basalt composition known in the region. The powder's structure, under microscope, resembled glass microspheres, each perfectly spherical and hollow. Leland noted, "Material suggests rapid formation by intense heat. Absence of crystallization implies environment of total vacuum." The site was sealed within weeks. Subsequent permit requests to continue drilling were denied pending environmental review. Leland's data, later leaked through an academic correspondence, included the cryptic comment, "Depth unknown, sound carries differently below." By 2011, a private geotechnical company contracted for pipeline exploration inadvertently rediscovered the phenomenon. Their sonic logs near Goat Rocks recorded echo returns that delayed by more than 4 seconds, indicative of a cavity several kilometers wide. Engineers double-checked calibration. The anomaly persisted. The company's internal memo described the discovery as structural hollowness, inconsistent with volcanic geology. Archived memos from the early 1960 seconds hint that this was not new knowledge. A document labeled Subsurface Integrity Study Region 6 references zones of signal absorption identified by analog seismic tests as early as 1959. These records, stamped for limited circulation, warn that standard blasting near such zones may induce resonance not yet understood. Rachel Ng, continuing her research in 2020, compared modern radar maps with those historic seismic charts. The overlap was exact. Beneath the forests, a continuous hollow extended along the same north-south corridor that mirrored the disappearances, the hum, and the magnetic drift. Ng wrote, "It is less a void than a structure that resists measurement, an absence with geometry." Field notes from a 2017 expedition provide rare first-hand description. 2 technicians conducting gravimetric surveys reported a soft return underfoot, the sensation of hollow earth below solid ground. One wrote, "The hammer test rang high, almost metallic. The audio recording from that day captured a distinct reverberation lasting nearly 6 seconds, though the microphone was placed directly on the soil." Core samples collected near those coordinates revealed another anomaly: fossilized roots suspended above empty space, as though growth had occurred over air rather than soil. The absence of compaction suggested that the void beneath had existed long before the current forest grew. In 2018, the Washington State Geological Division quietly commissioned a deep penetration survey using low-frequency seismic tomography. The results, never published but referenced in internal correspondence, indicated an extensive subsurface feature extending from 46 degrees N to 48 degrees N latitude, with a lateral width averaging 2 miles. The report's concluding line, declassified by accident in 2022, reads, "Nature uncertain, no echo." Dr. Leland, now retired, has occasionally spoken about the event in interviews. He describes the hollow as not a cave, not a tunnel system, more like an absence layered into the rock. When asked if it could be volcanic, he replies, "It predates the volcanoes." Satellite gravimetry adds another piece. Between 2015 and 2020, measurements from the GRACEFO mission showed minor gravitational fluctuations along the corridor, minute decreases, consistent with mass deficit underground. The pattern pulses seasonally, increasing during spring melt and fading in winter, suggesting fluid movement within or above the void. Yet no corresponding surface water network exists. In 2023, a remote drilling test conducted near Randall reached a depth of 500 meters before abruptly losing all signal. The drill string detached, falling into a space of unknown size. For 12 seconds, the vibration sensor continued transmitting faint oscillations before cutting off entirely. Recovery attempts failed. The replacement drill, lowered 2 days later, encountered no bottom within its cable length of 800 meters. Modern maps now mark the area simply as unstable substrate. Public access remains open, though researchers know what lies beneath. The forest stands upon something that absorbs sound, signal, and sense alike. Beneath roots, beneath rivers, a hollow body mirrors the surface, vast, patient, and silent. Those who have stood on the coordinates say the air feels lighter, the ground less certain. When you strike a shovel into the soil, the echo returns too slowly, as if traveling through a longer world below. The restricted expedition. In late September of 2019, a quiet memorandum circulated among select divisions of the U.S. Forest Service, the Department of Energy, and the U.S. Geological Survey. The memo, marked Interagency Field Review, Region 6, authorized a joint operation to investigate anomalous subsurface readings detected during earlier magnetic and seismic tests near the Mount Adams sector. Publicly, the expedition was logged as a standard infrastructure survey. Internally, it carried another title, Project Meridian. The team assembled under conditions of silence. 14 members were listed on the deployment roster, 6 from the Forest Service, 3 DOE engineers, 2 geophysicists from the USGS, and a small security detail with no departmental insignia. The staging area was an old ranger outpost west of Trout Lake, long decommissioned and surrounded by dense cedar. Equipment shipments arrived at night, sealed crates, marked with codes rather than serial numbers. According to later interviews and leaked field notes, the team began their survey on October 3. Their objective was to reach one of the strongest magnetic nodes mapped during the Hollow survey, a coordinate labeled Sector 22. They brought ground, penetrating radar, portable magnetometers, and a bore probe equipped with an optical feed. Communications were routed through an encrypted satellite channel. All transmissions were logged automatically. The first anomaly appeared less than 3 hours into the operation. As the convoy crossed a Forest Service road, compasses rotated 90 degrees, aligning not north but east. GPS receivers lost connection despite clear sky. The logs show multiple resets between 8:47 and 9:12. The lead geophysicist, identified in later documents as Dr. Harold Keene, recorded in his notes, "Magnetics behaving rhythmically, oscillation appears organic." By midday, the team established Base Point A near a moss-covered clearing. It matched the coordinates of an earlier 1975 disappearance. The radar arrays were deployed and ran continuous scans for 6 hours. The initial data matched previous Hollow's return signals, vanishing at roughly 240 meters. But around 15, the readings began to pulse, creating a pattern that resembled a heartbeat. Instruments captured wave intervals of precisely 27 hours, identical to those observed in prior magnetic fluctuations. An audio technician monitoring ambient microphones noted a slow build of infrasound beneath the normal range of hearing. The recording shows a low-frequency rise beginning at 15:42, peaking for 3 minutes, then falling away. Several team members reported nausea and mild disorientation. One entry in Keene's field log reads, "Sensation of depth increasing while standing still." At 16:10, they deployed the bore probe, a slender cable carrying light, camera, and temperature sensors, into a narrow drill shaft. The feed showed soil, then compact basalt, then blackness. At 268 meters, the temperature dropped sharply. The next frame displayed what analysts later described as particulate movement consistent with airborne matter. The probe continued another 10 meters before the signal fractured into static. Then, for 4 seconds, the feed transmitted an image that none of the agencies have publicly released. The archived metadata labels it only as frame 1473, irregular geometry, termination event. What is known is that all telemetry ended simultaneously at 1628. Power readings at base point A surged, then died. Backup generators engaged automatically, but failed to transmit. The satellite link cut off for 9 minutes. When the connection returned, the channel carried no data, only a low oscillating tone at 9.3 Hz. 3 team members who had remained at the secondary camp 2 kilometers away reported seeing a flash of pale light through the trees at the same moment. Their watches, synchronized earlier that morning, now differed by 5 minutes. The official record shows that the operation was suspended that evening due to instrumental malfunction. However, internal correspondence recovered later from DOE archives indicates that several members of the crew remained on site overnight under security order. They were retrieved by helicopter the next morning, October 4, at 7:10. One equipment container was missing. In the following days, the operations data was sealed under classification code 52A, typically reserved for energy infrastructure vulnerabilities. A 1-page press summary stated that subsurface conditions proved unsuitable for further testing. Yet, satellite imagery from the same week shows a small exclusion perimeter established around the site roughly 400 meters across patrolled by unmarked vehicles for nearly 3 months. A whistleblower from the USGS later described what was recovered from the malfunctioning bore probe. The device had been found intact near the surface days later, as though pushed upward. Its lens had fused from heat, but the final millisecond of recorded data contained an energy spike similar to gamma radiation, though no radiation residue was detected in the soil. The analysis report ends with the line, "Source transient, dissipated instantly." In 2020, when Rachel Ng petitioned for release of Project Meridian data, her request was denied in full. The response letter cited ongoing assessment of subsurface resource potential, yet references to the expedition appear in due procurement filings under the heading Non-Standard Acoustic Survey Technologies. Local witnesses near Trout Lake recall hearing helicopters at night through October and November, followed by weeks of silence. One resident described faint vibrations felt through the ground, like distant thunder that never arrives. After December, the activity ceased. Today, the coordinates of Sector 22 fall within a temporary research closure zone. Satellite imagery shows no structures, only a patch of forest darker than the surrounding canopy. Instruments brought near the area still lose calibration. Compasses drift, GPS stalls. Even drone footage develops artifacts frames that stretch and bend as if light itself were passing through uneven air. What happened during the restricted expedition remains unwritten. The files are sealed, the participants reassigned. Only fragments remain: oscillations, lost minutes, and an image that no one will describe. The unmarked center. There is a point where every map ends, a coordinate erased by revision, a contour line that no longer appears. In Washington's forests, this point is known among researchers as the center. It is not marked by any stone or structure. It exists as convergence, where all records, magnetic readings, and disappearances fold into one. Every trail of evidence traced across a century seems to curve toward this unseen heart of the land. No one can agree on its exact location. Each decade, the coordinates drift slightly, as if the ground itself adjusts beneath the trees. Attempts to fix it through geometry crossing disappearance sites, hum sources, and flux vectors always end the same way: a vanishing point that refuses to stay still. In the spring of 2022, a final expedition tried to find it. It was led by Rachel Ng, the independent researcher behind the Disappearance Index and the Hollow Survey. With her were 3 assistants, a field technician, a geophysicist, and a sound engineer named Robert Lund. They called their operation the Closing Survey. Their aim was not excavation, but measurement to catch the corridor in its last motion before it faded. They entered the Gifford Pinchot forest through an abandoned fire road northwest of Trout Lake. The air that morning was cold and windless. As they advanced, compasses began to drift inward, not toward north, but toward a line that cut through the trees at a precise bearing of 118 degrees. Compass convergence, Ng wrote in her notebook, all needles pulling the same direction toward absence. At noon, the insects stopped. Their instruments detected faint oscillations at 9.3 Hz, the same frequency found in the hum recorded decades earlier. Microphones confirmed a vibration below hearing range, repeating every 3 seconds. The forest itself seemed to pulse. Lund described it as the quiet breathing of the ground. By afternoon, they reached a shallow depression roughly 60 meters across, surrounded by cedar. The soil was pale and dry, flecked with fragments of black basalt. It was the same site marked Sector 22 inches, the classified Project Meridian report. Ing's log records the time, 1547. They deployed seismic sensors around the edge and lowered a small bore camera into the center. At 1558, all devices peaked at once. The vibration increased in strength, but not in volume, producing a pressure that could be felt rather than heard. The bore feed flickered, then showed particulate motion like dust drifting through liquid. Branches bent slightly, though there was no wind. For 12 seconds, the sensors transmitted overlapping waves before cutting out completely. Then, blankness. Data later showed a 4-hour gap in every instrument. The team's watches disagreed when power returned. The last timestamp before failure was 1558. The next was 942. The forest around them appeared unchanged, the air steady, the light strangely constant. Returned to ridge. Ing wrote afterward, no sense of passage, no fatigue, no sound of time. Back in Seattle, weeks later, the recordings were recovered and amplified. They revealed a double waveform, 2 identical pulses, one rising and one descending. When plotted visually, the pattern formed a spiral, the same spiral drawn on the 1899 map by surveyor E.J. Halvorsen, labelled Zone of Unstable Reading. Satellite imagery from that night confirmed a transient mark at those coordinates, a perfect ring, 72 meters wide, cooler than its surroundings by 3 degrees. The pattern lasted less than a day before vanishing under rain. The geometry matched earlier clearings, photographed in 2004, 2011, and again in 2019, always appearing along the magnetic corridor. In Ning's final private report, she proposed that the forest's phenomena, magnetic drift, hum, and lost time, were not separate anomalies, but stages of one process reaching equilibrium. Frequency converging toward zero, she wrote. System approaching stillness, the pattern closing itself. After that, her research stopped. She left no new publications, no further correspondence. The closing survey remains her last field entry. Since that spring, the corridor has grown quiet. Rangers who once heard the low vibration say it faded year by year, like machinery winding down. Magnetic deviation weakened. Compass drift fell to near zero. The silent camps remain where they were found, but their outlines soften under moss. Drone footage taken in 2024 shows the pale circles shrinking, their edges blurring into vegetation. Even the cold zones measured by satellites are disappearing. When the Geological Division repeated its radar tests in 2023, the voids that once absorbed every pulse returned faint reflections. Analysts describe the change as solidification of previous hollows. The air pressure inside the corridor stabilized. No known mechanism explains how absence becomes filled. Radio operators across the region began to notice something else. Instead of distorted echoes, they received a single steady tone, exactly 9.3 Hz, lasting 3 minutes before silence. It appeared only once, on a spring evening in 2023, and has never been repeated. To some, it marked the corridor's final signal. To others, it was confirmation that the pattern had completed its cycle. Now, when hikers enter those forests, they find no traces of the research zones. The markers and tape lines are gone. Signs once warning of magnetic interference have been removed. The basin that Ing described is barely visible, replaced by a faint rise of earth, round and smooth. On satellite scans, it appears as a shallow dome covered in young trees. Its label in government databases reads simply, topographic adjustment resolved. At ground level, the place feels ordinary. Birds have returned. The air moves again. Phones hold signal. Yet those who pause too long, they describe a sense of perfect stillness, like the moment before a sound begins. When you strike the soil with a stick, the echo lingers a fraction too long, as if travelling through a deeper layer beneath. Every force that once defined the corridor sound, magnetism, time distortion has quieted. But quiet does not mean gone. The harmonics that once pulsed beneath the cascades continue faintly in seismic data, a residual heartbeat that passes from north to south roughly once each lunar cycle. It is weaker each year, but never disappears entirely. Some researchers call it residual charge, the fading energy of a geological anomaly. Others think it was never about physics at all, but balance forces seeking symmetry until motion became rest. It ended when it completed itself, one analyst said during a 2024 review. Everything that was out of alignment finally settled. There are still those who visit the place without instruments. They go not to measure, but to listen. Standing in the clearing at dusk, you can sometimes feel the smallest tremor underfoot, a pulse too soft to register on any chart. Whether it is memory, or machinery, or the last slow breath of the land, no one knows. The center no longer belongs to coordinates or maps. It has folded back into the forest, leaving only equilibrium in its place. The pattern that once stretched across mountains has closed upon itself, quiet and complete. The hum, the drift, the missing hours, all have resolved into silence. If you walk the trails at night, when the air is heavy and even the animals hold still, you might sense it, the faint balance beneath everything, the weightless pause that the instruments once captured and lost. It feels not like a mystery waiting to be solved, but like an equation that has already found its answer. And beneath the cedars, under soil that once absorbed every signal, the lattice remains motionless, unrecorded, perfect. The center was never hidden, it was only waiting to stop. The forests of Washington remain, the roads are open, the trails restored, and yet, behind every tree line lies a silence that no science has fully measured. The hum has faded, the compasses have steadied, but the maps still carry a faint memory of what moved beneath them, a pattern older than record, written not in ink, but in absence. What remains is quiet, almost calm, as though the land itself has chosen to sleep again. But every so often, a new report appears, another echo, another pulse beneath the cedar roots, and the geometry stirs once more. If this story has drawn you into the stillness of these woods, join us as we continue exploring the forgotten, the unexplained, and the unseen. Subscribe, stay curious, and return with us to the places where the maps end, where silence itself keeps its own kind of record.